No such thing as easy money? How about easy gold? Non-metal metal. 3 words that strike fear into new painters and batch painters, and heck, even some experienced painters too. That includes me. It's something I've not really done on my channel before, simply because, well, I'm no expert at it either. But I do have a pretty simple method for something that gives a satisfying enough result. Who needs gold anyway? Well, Saurians from one-page rules are pretty much decked out in this stuff, so it's a pretty simple task to decide on models to show off some bling on. I'm going to go with one of the pterodactyl riders because he's got a nice face full of gold, but also the gecko chief because nothing says glam like a leader bean. To make this simple, it will require learning a new technique. Don't worry, the technique itself is quite easy, but not something that's seen done a lot. And it's actually only something I learned years ago from one of my coworkers when I used to work at a GW store. It's a bit of a halfway between a dry brush and a layer. It starts with some paint, of course. I'm going to use one of my Vallejo Game Air paints, simply because I want to show that this is still a valid technique with a fluid paint, as opposed to the heavy body ones that I usually use. And unlike everything you've been told, do not thin this paint. Unless using heavy bodies, then a bit of thinner is useful. The idea is to create a flat plane out of the bristles of the brush. This isn't going to be good for them, so make sure it's not your fine point one being used for this. You get the brush to hold like this by drawing it across the palette or some paper towel, but unlike how normally we roll it into a point, we purposefully let the bristles splay a bit. Then comes the step of getting the paint onto the model. A flat plane is best for this, though not specifically a flat surface, as we'll get to later when doing the gold. But a base like this is good for practice. With the wide flat surface we created with the brush, draw it across the level surface of the area being painted. It might take a bit of practice to get the angle right, but somewhere between a 45 and 20 degree angle to the surface being painted is about right. When it comes to painting deep sections, go side to side with the tip of the brush, while the rest of the bristles rest on a higher portion. What should happen is the bristles of the brush add a full layer of paint to anything they can touch. But anything with cracks or corners won't get touched as they're too deep for the long flat bristles to get into. So like a dry brush, shadows remain darker, but like a layer, anything else gets a full coat of paint. Color selection for non-metal metal gold is pretty simple. We want to get from a dark yellow, either cool or warm, to over here, a light or saturated yellow. But make sure that the contrast stays in some way, and the opacity of yellow pigment really works for us in this regard. I've pre-painted the skin and scales of the geckos for 2 reasons. One is they're not important for the video. 2 is because I wanted to overspill onto the gold parts, because the first thing to do that will make non-metal metal gold easy is to rebase all those parts black. But not just any black, black with some dark red or brown mixed in. If you've watched my video on black paints, you'll know that a carbon black is blue shifted. So the red will make it warm again and make sure none of our yellows turn green. Doing this also gives nice black lines without any extra effort after. To get started with the gold, I've got 3 key colors on my palette. These can be changed around, of course, for different looks, but this version I'm going to go with a raw umber, which is a dark yellow shade brown, raw sienna, a light yellowish brown, but a yellow ochre would work, and in my case, the last color is Arylide yellow from Josanja, but any bright or warm yellow will work. It just depends on what you want your final gold to look like, and of course, some white. Now to make a decision. The first layer is going to be the deciding factor on how bright the gold's going to be. For a really strong contrast, starting with just the pure raw umber is going to be the way to go. But for a much brighter gold, by mixing in some of the raw sienna, or even starting with the raw sienna, it will start from a more saturated base. Either way though, This will get a normal layering on the gold parts, avoiding edges that lead into other colors. Now for the trick from earlier. By mixing some of the bright yellow into the base mix to get this first layer color, I'll get it in my bristles and flatten my brush again. I want to treat the object as one full shape, and non-metal metal is about painting the reflection lines. So I want to pick one solid line to draw across the whole object. Then once I have that, spread it out from there. The simple trick here is if you don't know where that line should go, a safe bet is just to draw it diagonal across the object. It won't be a perfect reflection that way, but a stylized one, which also works well. Because I'm using yellow and yellow is transparent, to get a feathering effect, we don't need to wet blend or feather anything. Just taking the exact same mix from before, by adding another layer to the center of the area painted prior, it'll make those colors more solid, leaving the edges a bit more faded. Adding a bit more of the yellow can help too, but isn't necessary. Now with just the pure bright yellow, we can do the same thing again, always using that flat brush method and a couple of coats. This one just centered in our reflection area again. If the flat area of the brush seems too wide, we can always go down a brush size. And because the flat part of the brush is what's being painted with, there's not too much risk about spilling into other colors, though still be careful with what's surrounding your gold object. So that leaves us with a really contrasting gradient from light to dark, or if a lighter brown was chosen at the start, a more brilliant gold. The last step will be to tie it all together. Adding white into some of the bright yellow, the goal is again to use the edge of the brush, though in this case it doesn't matter if it's flat or not, to create an outline of raised edges, all the way around, even into the dark parts. And there we go, a relatively simple non-metal metal gold. The key things are to have a strong contrast between colors, so the lighter the gold is, the more you want to go into white. Treat the object as a whole and don't break it up into its individual parts. Creating a single reflection line will keep things simple, and use multiple layers of the same color to create a gradient. Lastly, give the object a light outline. While I can appreciate that even my easy method isn't exactly beginner stuff, there is still more that can be done to really push the quality a little bit further. So these tips are just going to amend some of the things from the last section, and so can be subbed in and out as desired. In the first method, I simply drew a wide line down the middle of the object, but with some good brush control and a nice point, I can instead create a texture. Brushed metal tends to have parallel lines across the flat surface, so instead of just a single thick line, I make small, thin, parallel lines moving in the same diagonal direction I would have been for the single thick line, just sweeping over and over, building up the color as it dries towards where that reflection would be brightest. Then the same again with my lighter color. The brush would end up doing some of the same stuff, like skipping over gaps, but instead of a flat brush, it's a thin one, and much more movement. Along curved edges like the blade, I have the lines follow along with the edges of the curve or the blade. While a full outline is a good way to add that edge reflection quickly and simply, it doesn't give any direction. So what I like to do instead is a point and extend method, using the light color like before, but instead of just going around all the edges, find the brightest points and give them a good dot of color. Even if it's a bit thick, that's still totally fine. Then once I have all my points, I go in with the edge of my brush and extend that reflection out along the edges. How far you get away from the original point is up to you. You can either go all the way around again and just have those few places where it bulges out, or by fading off the light it can give some direction as though the light can't actually reach some of the further edges. The last thing that can really make non-metal metal come to life is to add some alternate colors. Metal is technically a highly reflective surface. Even something like gold, there's all these other colors around it, so why not add them in? For external sources like the side of the axe facing away from the skin, something complementary like orange or red would be nice. And it's as simple as just thinning out a glaze and colorizing the surface. For the inside where the gecko's blue skin is, a blue or teal makes sense too, applied the exact same way. Doesn't have to be over the whole surface of course, but just a hint will give it some style. I'm not under any pretense that this is contest-winning non-metal metal gold, but what it is quick and still looks good. So when you've got a warband of 13 or more models all decked out in gold, you're not cursing yourself for not just going with a metallic. And a lot of the practice gained here are steps towards that perfect lusterless luster of non-metal metal. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.